All right, guys, good morning. Okay, so today we are going to be working through the last phase of World War II. This is my second attempt at trying to record it. So let's see how we do. All right, the first opening phase of World War One, you guys have already gone through. Okay, you guys have covered quite a bit of material. So today, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to really, in a lot of ways, sprint through the final phase of World War II. Okay, it starts off with D-Day. Okay, culturally, this is something you guys should be familiar with. Okay, it's a major campaign in Western Europe to start the process of liberating Western Europe from Nazi Germany. Okay, now you guys already know that there's been some significant turning points already in World War II, even before D-Day, starting with Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a significant victory for the Allies, mainly for the Soviet Union, I should say. And that stopped Germany's advance into the Soviet Union, into the oil-rich Caucasus region, and it really, in a lot of ways, sped the end of the war up in Europe. Okay, by denying Germany access to petroleum and to fuel and oil, that really limited their ability to wage war. The Germans actually, in a lot of ways, were struggling to produce enough combustion fuel, things like that, steel production, in order to keep pace with the overwhelming amount of material manpower that the Allies had. Okay, you guys already know, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. Now that all three of those countries are fighting against Germany, Italy, and Japan, just the sheer manpower and the access to raw materials and industrial capacity that those three countries had, the U.S., the Soviets, and the British, it dwarfed what the Axis powers had. Okay, the other big advantage that the Americans, the Soviets, and the British had was that virtually all of our industrial capacity was out of reach to our enemies. Okay, the Japanese could not bomb American, factories in our heartland. Okay, even the Germans had a hard time strategically bombing British manufacturing in the northern part of Britain. We saw that in the Battle of Britain. Most of the Soviet big industrial plants were way, way out in Siberia, east of the Ural Mountains, which we talked about before in class before this whole pandemic. So, that was a huge advantage that our factories could pretty much go humming along without having to worry about being bombed by enemy, strategic bombers. Where at the same time, obviously, the United States and the British, we had a massive bombing fleet whose job it was to basically pulverize German and Japanese industrial war capacity. And we did that very thoroughly. Okay. So if you guys ever want to take a look at the landscape of Europe, especially the industrial centers of Europe after World War II, they were just completely decimated. We literally bombed them back to the Stone Age. Very few places in German occupied territories that were of any use militarily had any electricity or running water by the end of 1945. And the same thing in Japan. Okay, we'll talk about that today. Okay. All right. So these advantages really start to overwhelm, especially the Germans, in mid 1944. Okay, and that's what's going to lead to D-Day. We can see it's going to be the opening of a second front in Europe, a major second front against the Nazis, and we're going to see there's actually some political, parts of this as well. Okay. Now, again, you guys can kind of move back and forth as I talk through these slides. There's going to be some videos you're going to watch, a couple of questions you're going to answer. It's going to take about 2 periods to do. Okay, so don't anticipate getting this all done in 1 period. Okay, so let's move forward. All right, guys. The first big foothold that we have in Europe is actually Italy, and we theorized, us and the British, that Italy would be the soft underbelly because it's in the south of Nazi dominated Europe. The Italians had not fought very well in northern Africa. Their equipment was antiquated. In other words, it was old and out of date. Their soldiers were very poorly trained. They surrendered by the thousands in the North African campaign. So we really thought that this would be an easy way to get troops into southern Europe and force the Germans to split their forces, okay? force them into a physical second front, which obviously the Germans had fought to try to avoid the first couple of years of the war. But you guys can see that, once we took troops, and you guys can see where we basically landed troops from. Okay, we had troops in Tunisia, which is in northern Africa, after the North African campaign wrapped up, and we moved them amphibiously by way of ship to Sicily. When we landed in Sicily, we then started the very painstaking process of moving up the boot of Italy. Okay, Italy, not really hospitable terrain for modern armies. Okay, the spine of Italy is dominated by the Apennine Mountains. You guys can see that right here. Okay, these are rugged mountains, very jagged, declivitous, in other words, steep, not rolling, undulating hills like we have here in the eastern seaboard of America. The only two plains in Italy are really on the two coastlines. Okay, you have the Ligurian coast, okay, and the Positano coast down here, or the Neapolitan coast, I should say. These are a little bit flatter. Okay, over here you have plains in eastern Italy. So really, you only had two very narrow corridors that you could take up the coast of Italy, and because of that, the Germans did not have to dedicate a whole lot of men or material to stopping the Allied advance. Okay, both us and the British had a very difficult time moving up the boot of Italy. And you guys can see this is a time lapse, between September of 1943 all the way up to really, June of 1944. We did not make a lot of progress. Okay, it was very slow going. The Germans were able to fortify the mountain passes. They used elite paratrooper divisions to defend those passes with equipment. So the Italian campaign really kind of was a slobber knocker of a campaign. Okay, and that gave the soft underbelly of Europe, which is what Winston Churchill called Italy, the new name, Tough Old Gut. So I want you guys to click on the video Tough Old Gut. You guys are going to watch that. It's from the World at War series. It's going to start at 22 minutes. You're going to watch the whole thing through. And right here, I want you guys to list, the reasons why the Italian campaign was so difficult. Okay, what big problems did we run into? Both as far as terrain, what problems did we run into with the Germans themselves, and what problems did we run into with each other? Both the British and the Americans are trying to work together and coordinate together. That actually required some problematic issues to kind of overcome. So, what were they? I want you guys to write those down. Make sure you guys have that, because I will ask you when we have our assessment. Okay, so take your time to watch that. I'm going to move forward. Okay, you guys can stop me while you're watching that. So I'm going to move forward to the next slide. Okay, one of the reasons why we really wanted to open up a major second front in Europe, is because of the progress that the Soviets were making. Make sure you guys understand this, okay? After the Battle of Stalingrad was over, and you guys can see Stalingrad way over here, in the following months, the Soviets made enormous advances in terrain. The Germans were basically backpedaling on the Eastern Front from December of 1943 all the way until 1944, okay? And you guys can see that the Soviets launched 4 consecutive massive offensives. This is when their new armies that had just been, built up back in Siberia were now being thrown and hurled at the Germans. Just the overwhelming amount of material the Germans couldn't hold up, okay? The Soviets had, 2 men for every man the Germans had on the Eastern Front. The Soviets outproduced the Germans in tanks by the thousands. Okay, they produced 50,000 T-34 tanks over the course of World War II. The Germans all totaled only produced, I think, 15,000 tanks. Okay, for all fronts. All right, so overwhelming superiority in manpower, material. Okay, the reason why we get worried about what's going on over here is because it seems as if Eastern Europe is trading fascist Nazi German overlords with now Stalinist communist overlords. Okay, as Stalin and his armies moved through Eastern Europe, he started installing Soviet-friendly regimes in places like Romania, Hungary, Belarus, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and he was going to do the same thing over here in Poland. Okay, he was basically putting in communist regimes, and that worried us. We didn't want to sit back and let the Soviet Union invade all of Europe while we sat back here, in Great Britain and watched it happen. We didn't want to have to deal with the Soviet Union being the next big, menace to world peace. Okay, so we wanted to open up a big second front against the Germans to not just defeat Germany, but also to guarantee that we were going to have a say in how post-war Europe would play out and what it would look like politically. We obviously did not like the idea of all of Europe turning communist. That's not what we had in mind. We were fighting, as you guys should know from the Atlantic Charter, to ensure democratic principles in Europe. And that's exactly what the Soviets were working against over here. So even though we were fighting with the Soviets, we really were only allies out of necessity. We didn't really like each other. We didn't support each other's political stance. And we didn't get along with one another. Okay, so let's now move forward to the objectives. Okay, the D-Day objectives, okay, were for us to open up a major second front, okay, and politically we wanted to start to convert Western Europe back into democratic principles. So make sure you guys have both those things written down. We wanted to force the Germans to have to divide their forces between the Eastern Front and the Western Front, and also the Southern Front in Italy. That would basically precipitate or lead to the collapse militarily of Germany. But also, again, we were looking to influence the areas that we liberated and retook from Germany politically, and have them convert to a democratic system of government, okay, and not a fascist or a Soviet or communist form of government, okay? All right, moving forward, okay, let's talk about how we went about landing in Northern Europe, okay? You guys can see, you guys saw this in the video, Memphis Belle. Great Britain became basically a gigantic base militarily. Bomber bases, fighter bases, troop junctions, munitions depots, okay, harbors for, warships, okay. It literally, there wasn't one spot in England where you couldn't walk a mile and not run into some type of major military installation. And all of that was done in anticipation and preparation for the invasion, the retaking of Nazi-held France and Western Europe, okay? Now, when you look at it geographically, it would make sense that if we were going to try to land troops along the French coastline, that we should probably land them right here in a place called Calais. And the reason why is because Calais is only 19 miles from Dover. You can actually see the White Cliffs of Dover from northern France. That's how close it is. It would be easy to ferry men across, and that's exactly why we did not land in Calais, okay? Because the Nazis were anticipating it. They had mass troops along the Atlantic Wall here. We thought it was going to be a very difficult landing, even though Calais had nice, gradual sloping beaches. They had ports there. Everything seemed perfect to land troops there, and that's exactly why we did not do it, because the Germans anticipated. Okay, so we used all sorts of deceptive measures. We actually built a fake army down here in Dover to convince the Germans that we were going to land in Calais, when in fact we were going to land way down here on the Norman coastline. Okay, and the reason why we're going to land there is, first of all, it was a little bit closer to Paris, which obviously is the nerve center of France, but more importantly, it was so unhospitable to beach landings. It had high, big bluffs and cliffs overlooking the beaches. It seemed like it would be idiotic to land troops there. More importantly, there were no big natural harbors there. So all the troops and all the equipment, it would be very difficult to ferry it onto this area. That's exactly why we chose it. Okay, it was only lightly defended by the Germans, and we used that deception. On June 6th, we landed forces there, about 100,000 men in the first day, 200,000 men after a week, okay, millions of men after that. Okay, tanks, equipment, gasoline, fuel, ammunition, all that stuff was brought across and set up. We set up a beachhead here, and in the next several weeks, we started to break out on our mission to take Paris and to liberate France. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay, now I just explained to you the deception, okay, just kind of as a critical thinking exercise, okay, in what ways can deception be a valuable tool in warfare? How can it be used? We just gave an example there. Think back in, maybe mythology has examples of deception being used in warfare. What could they be? And then, can you think of any instances where deception played an important factor in a conflict that gave one side I guess, a leg up or an advantage over the other? Okay, so write that down real quick. All right, I'm going to move forward to the next slide. Okay, once we establish a beachhead over here in Normandy, you guys can see it over here. Okay, then you guys can match it up with the map. June 6th, you guys can see this gray area. We actually liberate that area here. We build up massive forces there, And then between July and September, which is not a lot of time, we have a massive breakout in France. We make huge gains. You guys can see virtually all of France is liberated within a couple of months. So, so when you take a look, July, August, September, within 3 months, we have really made huge moves forward in France. Okay, and the reason why is because most of Germany's mechanized forces were still over here on the Eastern Front fighting a defensive war. Okay, the Germans kept the vast majority of their equipment over here. We were up against a lot of poorly trained conscripts and recruits. The Germans had some elite divisions over here, but most of their attention was over here in the east. The Germans did not want to fall to the Soviets. Okay, that's why we made such big advances there. All right, so you guys can see what happened militarily. Germany's basically being squeezed between two giant vices, actually three giant vices. You can see us moving up the boot of southern Italy. You can see us moving across France. And you can see the Soviets moving across Eastern Europe. Okay, even Italy actually drops out of the war in 1944. They depose the fascist government. And believe it or not, the Italians switch sides the same way they did in World War I. All right, so when you take a look at this, Germany's on their own, okay, for the rest of the war here, okay? And really, when you look at the time frame from June to May of 1945, it's less than a year, okay? It's only about 11 months from us landing in northern France to Germany surrendering, okay? They just could not contain the massive amounts of equipment and all the front that they had to police here with their forces. It couldn't hold up. Okay, so the end comes pretty quickly after the D-Day landings in France. Okay, and now it becomes really almost a race between us and the Soviets for control of as much territory in Eastern and Western Europe as possible. We're trying to spread democracy. They're trying to spread Soviet-friendly governments and communist regimes. Okay, and that really becomes the new competition. Okay, let's move forward. All right, guys, significance of the liberation of Western Europe. The military impact on the war, fairly significant, as you guys already wrote down or should have written down. We open up a second major front. It forces the Germans to split their forces, and it precipitates or speeds the collapse of Germany militarily, leading to the liberation of Europe. Okay, the political significance is that it sets the stage for what's going to be called the Cold War. We are politically installing democratic regimes and encouraging democracy, whereas at the same time, in the East, the Soviets are installing communist regimes. So make sure you guys write that down, because that's going to set the table for the next big conflict globally, and that's going to be the Cold War. Okay, so I'm going to move forward. You guys can write that stuff down. Okay, we're going to move forward now to the Pacific theater of World War II. Okay, much different theater of operations. Okay, after the Battle of Midway, where we crushed the Japanese offensive naval power, okay, by destroying 4 of their aircraft carriers, we start on a long, difficult campaign, what's called the island hopping campaign, okay? And the reason why they called it that is because we literally hopped from island to island to island, and our objective, and you guys are going to write this down in the next couple of slides here, okay, our objective was to establish bases close to Japan, okay? And the reason why we needed military bases close to Japan is because we anticipated that we were going to have to physically invade Japan itself, which was going to be a difficult task. So we needed bases so that we could launch jump-off points from to get closer to Japan. Okay, we also, and you guys want to write this down on the next slide, we also specifically targeted islands that the Japanese held that already had air base facilities there. Okay, because we wanted to start the process of strategically bombing Japan to soften Japan up and to cripple their economy in preparation for us landing forces in Japan itself, okay? This was a 1 to 2 year long process, okay? You guys can see it would have taken massive amounts of equipment and material to ship these men across the ocean, literally, to land them on these bases, to supply them, okay? They're being supplied from the United States factories. In order to supply them, we had to build not just a navy, and in this case, an enormous navy. We also had to build a huge flotilla of transportation vessels, okay? Thousands of what we called victory or liberty ships, okay? We got it to the point where we could build from start to finish one in about 8 days, which is ridiculous. Okay. Um, so the industrial capacity of the United States really played a decisive role in World War II. The most important type of vessels that we built, other than transportation ships, were aircraft carriers. Okay, aircraft carriers gave us offensive punch. What an aircraft carrier is, you guys want to write this down somewhere. It's just a giant ship that can launch and land aircraft. Okay, so that means that bombers and fighters can actually be moved across the ocean and can be, basically have a floating base, so to speak, to launch attacks and raids. Okay, now the bigger airplanes, the bombers that we needed to strategically bomb Japan with, we physically needed to have bases closer to Japan in the Mariana and Marshall Islands. Okay, and so we started the process of strategically bombing Japan in late 1944 with our bombers. Okay, and by the end of 1944, there really weren't a whole lot of strategic targets left. Okay, we had bombed and flattened most of Japan's industries by the beginning of 1945. Okay, now this was a much different type of war. Okay, a series of amphibious invasions, massive naval forces involved between us and the Japanese. Okay, so what I want you guys to do now, okay, after you guys have listed the objectives of the island hopping campaign, I want you to watch this video of the landing on Peleliu. Okay, Peleliu was a Japanese-held island way down here in the where's that? A little bit north of New Guinea. Okay, and the landing on Peleliu really is a good example of the difficulties of retaking these islands. Okay, these islands were fanatically defended by the Japanese. Many of the Japanese, garrisons fought literally to the last man. Okay, and they were very skilled defenders. Okay, so you guys are going to watch this video. It is visceral. Okay, so you guys prepare yourselves. And this would have been indicative of any of the landings in the Pacific. Okay, so watch that, and then I'll move forward. Okay, guys. After watching the video and after discussing it and me talking about it, how was the Pacific theater of war so much different from the African and European theaters of warfare that we've discussed before? Okay, so just write that down. How was the nature of warfare different? What type of vehicles and weapons were different in the Pacific theater versus the European theater, and how is the nature of fighting different from what we just saw? Okay, so take a minute or two to jot that down. This will be on the test next week, and I'll move forward. All right, finally, okay, the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Okay, the atomic bomb is a weapon developed over several years. Okay, in fact, it starts off with Albert Einstein, and when he emigrated to the United States because of the Holocaust and Nazi policies in Germany, he was German. He was German. He was Jewish as well. He said, "You know what? We here in America need to get started on a program to develop an atomic weapon because the Germans already have a head start. The Germans started their program in 1936. We didn't get our program started until 1940. Okay, this is a weapon that can wipe out an entire city with just one bomb. So instead of sending thousands of bombers to bomb one industrial target like we saw in the Memphis Belle, this weapon had the ability to wipe out an entire city with just one bomb. So it really would have made the job a lot easier. It would have facilitated the, the strategic bombing of enemy targets. And it was a terrifying weapon if it ever worked. Okay, so over the course of years, it was the most expensive project that we ever engaged in our history, believe it or not. If you put it into dollar and cents today, it would have been trillions of dollars. Okay, to develop this weapon. The Manhattan Project was where we took really all of our best scientists, all of our best engineers. We had them all across the country developing different parts and different mechanisms to create an atomic weapon. When it all came together in late 1944, we had a bomb that could, again, literally wipe out an entire city. Okay, we had tested it down in New Mexico at Alamogordo. Okay, and now we were ready to start using it on Japan. Now, the reason why we wanted to use it, it was actually initially meant to be used on Germany, on Berlin, but the Germans surrendered in May. Okay, the war was already over before we were ready to use this bomb. Okay, but it became apparent that it might be more useful to use it against Japan because Japan was fighting so fanatically to defend its islands. And we did not want to have to land in Japan. You guys want to write this down under military objectives, okay? Okay, we thought having to invade Japan, it would have been a military nightmare. Okay, it would have taken years to do successfully. We would have needed the Soviet Union's help. One of the weird things of World War II is the Soviets they didn't declare war on Japan until the very end. Okay, but we knew that we were going to need Soviet help and also Soviet bases up here in Mongolia and Manchuria to help invade Japan. We didn't want that because we didn't want the Soviets installing, a Soviet-friendly government in Japan. We wanted Japan to be democratic in the future. Okay, so we wanted to keep them out of the equation politically. Militarily, we thought it was going to take up to 1 million casualties to successfully take over and occupy and defeat Japan militarily. Okay, on top of that, it would have taken 10 times more Japanese casualties. Okay, so we anticipated between 10 and 15 million Japanese casualties. If we launched a full-scale invasion, the war might have taken 5 to 10 more years. We weren't quite sure. Okay, we were already in enormous amounts of debt by 1945. We were ready for this thing to be over. So the weapon that allowed us to do that was the atomic bomb. Okay, so militarily, we wanted a hasty end to the war. We did not want to have to invade Japan because of how difficult the island hopping campaign was. Okay, and we wanted to avoid massive casualties. All right, on both sides, on our side, and on theirs. Okay, the atomic bombs killed, we think, roughly all told, 200,000 people. Okay, give or take, a couple of thousand here or there from the after effects. When you put that up next to potentially millions dying in an invasion of Japan, people would have argued back then that this was a better option. Okay, politically, it enabled us to liberate, or not liberate, but take over Japan without having to rely on Soviet help. We did not want the Soviets again installing a communist dictatorship in Japan or in any part of Japan. We prefer to have Japan be a future friend of the United States, and we wanted to encourage democracy there. Okay. All right, guys. Like I said, this is going to take you one or two class periods to finish up. Okay, so take your time to work through these. These are due on Friday for both CP and accelerated. Okay, so when you guys are all done, submit that, and we will get back together next week. Okay, bye.